By the time Dean Martin stepped into the room, he already knew this was not a place where questions were answered, only accepted, obeyed, or paid for later. The room sat behind the showroom, past velvet curtains and laughter that sounded too loud to be real. It was after midnight when Las Vegas exhaled smoke and secrets in equal measure. The walls were dark, the lights low, the air thick with cologne and cigarette ash. Men sat without moving much because they didn't need to. Power, when it's real, doesn't fidget. Dean paused just long enough to read the temperature. He had learned that skill early, reading rooms, reading faces, reading silence. It was how you survived in entertainment. Smile when expected. Joke when required. Leave before the mood shifted. Tonight, the mood had already shifted before he arrived. "Dean," one of them said, voice smooth, almost friendly. "Sit." It wasn't an invitation. It never was. He sat. From the outside, this looked like business. That was always the trick. A conversation, a favor, an opportunity dressed up as generosity. Inside, though, everyone understood the structure. These men didn't make movies. They didn't sing songs, but they decided who got close enough to do either. Someone poured a drink without asking. Whiskey, heavy glass. Dean didn't touch it. "You've got something coming up," the man across from him said, fingers resting on the table like punctuation. "A picture, good role, good exposure." Dean nodded slowly. "That's what they tell me." A few smiles appeared, not warm ones, measuring ones. "There's a kid," another voice added from the corner. "Needs a break, real talent, family's been supportive." Supportive, the word landed with weight. Dean finally lifted the glass, more to buy time than interest. He didn't drink. He set it back down exactly where it had been. "Casting not my department," he said calmly. "You know that." The room didn't argue, it adjusted. The first man leaned forward. "You misunderstand. We're not asking you to cast anyone. We're asking you not to stand in the way." That was the line, the invisible border. Step back and let things happen. Look the other way. Let the system work as it always had. Nobody would blame him. Nobody ever did. Dean felt the familiar pressure behind his ribs, not fear exactly, recognition. He had seen careers vanish for less than a raised eyebrow. Singers stopped getting booked. Actors stopped getting calls. Friends stopped calling friends. He thought of all the men who had nodded in rooms like this. Men who told themselves it wasn't their fight. Men who went home and slept just fine. "Who's standing in the way?" Dean asked. The silence answered first. "You are," the man said gently, "if you choose to be." That was how they framed it, choice as burden, compliance as kindness. Dean looked around the table. These weren't brutes. They were accountants of fear. They knew exactly how much pressure to apply without leaving fingerprints. No threats, no shouting, just inevitability. Another man spoke, almost apologetically. "This isn't personal, it's how things work." Dean smiled then, small and tired. That's usually when it's personal. The air shifted, not dangerously yet, but enough. "You've done well," the first man continued. "We want you to keep doing well. Nobody wants problems." Problems? The word hung there, undefined on purpose. Dean thought about the kid they wanted pushed through. Thought about the dozens who never even got a chance because rooms like this decided otherwise. Thought about how easy it would be to nod, shake hands, and walk back onto the stage to applause. He leaned back in his chair. "I don't do that," he said quietly. The smiles disappeared. One of the men exhaled smoke, slow and deliberate. "Do what?" Dean met his eyes. "I don't carry favors I didn't earn, and I don't sell rooms that aren't mine." The table went still. The first man tilted his head. "You should think carefully." Dean didn't move. "I am." A pause stretched long enough to feel like a test. Then the man spoke again, softer now. "This isn't a room you say no in." Dean stood. "Then," he said, voice steady, "you shouldn't have asked." No one stopped him as he walked out. but everyone understood what that silence meant. By morning, the city had already heard. Not in headlines, not in print, but in pauses that lasted too long and phone calls that never came. Las Vegas was skilled at pretending nothing happened while adjusting everything beneath the surface. By noon, Dean Martin could feel it. Doors still opened, but slower. Smiles still appeared, but thinner, strained at the edges. He stood by the window of his hotel room, tie loosened, watching the strip burn off the last of the night. Neon signs blinked like tired eyes. Below, men in suits walked with purpose, each one pretending he wasn't part of something larger than himself. The phone rang. Dean didn't rush to answer it. He let it ring until the sound felt intentional. Then he picked up. "Dean," a familiar voice said, low and careful. "You got a minute?" "For you sure?" A pause, the kind that meant the other man was choosing words like stepping stones. "I heard you had a conversation." Dean looked out at the street again. "That's one word for it." Another pause. "You didn't have to do that." There it was, not admiration, not support, caution disguised as concern. "I did," Dean replied. "I did have to." The voice sighed. "Listen, I'm not judging. I'm just telling you this isn't how people stay working." Dean smiled faintly. "Funny, that's exactly how some people stay working." The line went quiet. When the man spoke again, his voice had changed. "Be careful." The call ended without goodbye. By afternoon, the warnings multiplied. A producer who suddenly had a meeting, a manager who suggested postponing decisions, a studio executive who spoke in riddles and avoided eye contact. No one said the word mafia. No one had to. Dean walked through a studio lot later that day, the sun bright enough to feel cruel. Sets stood half-built, artificial worlds waiting for permission to exist. He passed a group of young actors rehearsing lines, voices full of hope. None of them knew how fragile that hope was. None of them had been invited into rooms like the one he'd left. Someone caught up to him near a soundstage. "Dean." It was an old friend, a man who had laughed with him, drank with him, trusted him. Now his eyes kept darting away. "You should have called me," the man said. "For what?" Dean asked. "So I could tell you not to do what you did." Dean stopped walking. "Would you have?" The man hesitated. That was answer enough. "They're serious," the man continued. "This wasn't a suggestion. They don't like being embarrassed." Dean leaned against a wall, crossing his arms. "I didn't embarrass anyone." The man shook his head. "You embarrassed the system." That landed harder. "They can stall things," the man said quietly. "Projects, appearances, money, they don't have to touch you to hurt you." Dean nodded once. "I know." "Then why?" The man stopped himself, lowered his voice. "Why make yourself the problem?" Dean looked past him at the rows of sound stages stretching into the distance. "Because if I didn't," he said, "someone else would be." The friend stared at him, searching for bravado, for a punchline. There was none. "They won't forget this," the man warned. Dean met his gaze. "Neither will I." That night Dean sat alone in a quiet bar off the strip. No music, no crowd, just the low hum of refrigeration and a bartender who didn't ask questions. He finally took a drink, let it burn. He thought about the men in the room, about how easily they had assumed he'd fold, about how often they were right. He also thought about the next step, because there was always a next step. The door opened. A man entered and took the stool beside him without asking. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the man said softly. Dean didn't look at him. "That's one way to see it." "There's still time," the man continued. "Fix this, say the right things, let the picture move forward." Dean turned finally. "And if I do?" The man smiled without warmth. "Then people stop protecting you." Dean held his gaze. "Who says I'm being protected?" The man's smile faded. "You've got 48 hours, he said, standing. "After that, it's not a conversation anymore." He walked out, leaving silence behind. Dean finished his drink, set the glass down, and understood exactly what those 48 hours meant. The meeting took place in the afternoon, which made it worse. Violence preferred night, threats felt heavier in darkness, but this was meant to feel reasonable, professional, as if daylight could sanitize what was about to happen. Dean arrived early, not out of nerves, but choice. He wanted the room empty when he entered, wanted to hear his own footsteps, wanted to feel the decision settle fully into his bones before anyone tried to bend it. The room was larger than the first one, brighter, windows covered by thin blinds that let in just enough sun to remind everyone where they were. A long table dominated the center, leather chairs, water instead of whiskey. Respect on the surface. They filed in one by one, familiar faces, calm expressions, men who looked like executives because that's what power learned to resemble. Dean, the same man from before, said, "Glad you came." Dean nodded. "You asked." "We did," the man gestured to a chair. "Sit." Dean stayed standing. That caused the first crack, subtle but real. "This doesn't need to be dramatic," another man said, attempting a smile. "We just want to close the loop." Dean folded his arms, "Then say what needs saying." The first man sighed, as if burdened by Dean's stubbornness. "You created a problem, one that affects people beyond you." "I didn't create anything," Dean replied evenly. "I just didn't cooperate." "That's the same thing," the man said, "in our world." Dean looked around the table. "That's the problem with your world." Silence followed, not shocked, assessing. "You've been given chances," a third man said. "Warnings, time. Most people appreciate that." Dean nodded. "I do." "And yet," the man continued, "here we are." Here we are, the phrase meant the line had been crossed. No more hints, no more courtesies. The first man leaned forward. "We don't like ultimatums, but you left us no room." Dean finally pulled out a chair and sat, not because they told him to, but because he was ready. "Say it," he said. The man's eyes hardened. "The casting goes through as discussed. You publicly support the picture, or things start unraveling." Dean didn't blink. "For me." "For everyone around you," the man corrected. "Managers, musicians, crew, people who don't get paid if you become difficult." There it was, the real weapon, guilt sharpened into leverage. Dean rested his hands on the table. He thought about the people who depended on him, thought about how clean their hands stayed while forcing him to dirty his. "You're asking me to teach them something," Dean said. The men exchanged glances. "What's that?" one asked. "That if pressure's applied hard enough," Dean continued, "principles are optional." The first man smiled thinly. "Principles don't keep lights on." "No," Dean agreed, "but they tell you who you are when the lights go out." The smile vanished. "You're not a martyr," the man snapped. "You're an entertainer." Dean leaned in. "And you're not kings. You're just men who have gone too long without being told no." The temperature dropped instantly. One of the men stood, careful. Dean didn't raise his voice, didn't pound the table, he simply spoke. "I won't make the call, I won't sign off, and I won't pretend this is business." The room erupted not in noise but movement. Chairs shifted, breaths quickened, eyes narrowed. "You're choosing this," the first man said, dangerously calm. Dean nodded. "I am." "You understand what happens next." Dean held his gaze. "I understand what happens if I don't." A long pause stretched across the room. The blinds rattled faintly as a truck passed outside. Finally the man leaned back. "Then we're done." Dean stood. "No," he said quietly, "you are." He walked to the door, hands steady on the handle. Behind him the man spoke one last time. "You won't like how this ends." Dean didn't turn around. "I already decided how it ends," he said. "You just don't control it anymore." He stepped out, closing the door on a silence that promised consequences. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It never did. It came in fragments, a contract quietly revised, a venue that suddenly changed direction, a film that drifted into development limbo without explanation, no announcements, no confrontations, just erosion. Dean Martin felt it in the weeks that followed. The phone still rang, but with different voices, smaller rooms, safer offers, people who spoke faster as if afraid to linger. He accepted what work came and ignored what didn't. He didn't complain. Complaints were for people who believed someone was listening. What surprised him wasn't the punishment, it was the restraint. They could have done worse. Everyone knew it. And because everyone knew it, they didn't need to. One night backstage at a modest theater, a young performer approached him, nervous, unsure whether the conversation itself might be noticed. "I heard what you did," the kid said. Dean studied his face, hope mixed with fear, the same combination he'd seen 100 times. "Careful what you hear," Dean replied. The kid swallowed. "They said you said no." Dean nodded. "I did." The kid hesitated. "Most people don't." Dean smiled, not proudly but honestly. "Most people aren't asked to." The kid nodded, understanding more than he said. He thanked Dean and walked away, shoulders a little straighter than before. That was how it spread, not loudly, not heroically, in glances, in pauses, in quiet recalculations. A few producers began pushing back in small ways, a casting decision here, a refusal there, nothing dramatic, just enough to remind the system that it was being watched now. The men in the rooms noticed. They always did. Dean was never invited back. That was the point, but he was also never erased. He remained useful, talented, popular enough to be inconvenient to destroy outright, so an unspoken truce formed. He stayed in his lane, they stayed out of his. Years later, someone asked him if it had been worth it. Dean thought for a long moment before answering. "I sleep," he said. "That counts for something." History doesn't record moments like these cleanly. There is no headline for restraint, no statue for refusal. The official story moved on, polished and simplified, but beneath it, another truth settled in. Power depends on silence more than violence. And silence, once broken, never sounds the same again. Dean Martin didn't dismantle a system. He didn't expose names or force confessions. He did something smaller and far rarer. He stood when sitting would have saved him. For the men who watched, it changed nothing. For the few who noticed, it changed just enough. Years later, when casting rooms felt a little less certain of themselves, when intimidation required more effort than before, when someone hesitated, just for a second, before making a call that crossed a line, the cause was never traced back to him. That was fine. Courage doesn't need credit, it needs continuity. Dean continued to work, to perform, to smile for cameras that never asked what it had cost him. The audience saw the charm, the ease, the voice. They never saw the rooms he'd walked out of or the ones that never called again. But some people remembered, quietly, with gratitude. And long after the smoke cleared from those back rooms, long after the men who ran them faded into footnotes and rumors, the lesson remained, passed not in speeches but in behavior. That power can be refused. That dignity has a weight no threat can fully lift. And that sometimes, the bravest act in history isn't loud rebellion or public defiance, but a simple word spoken calmly in a room where it was never supposed to be heard. No,